The Bavarians have stepped up their game with their naked rocket. It now boasts 5 more horsepower, a refreshed design, and numerous refinements throughout the model. How all that translates to real-world riding is exactly what we set out to find out. We spent 2 days on the road and 2 days on the racetrack, and there's a lot to talk about. During our test program, we rode the BMW in a wide range of conditions and put it through its paces thoroughly. But I wasn't testing alone. No, we also had our technical expert with us, 3-time IDM champion Martin Bauer. Joining us too was Lena Kemmer, who competed last year in the Women's World Championship on a Yamaha R7. We also had Philipp Bettner with us, our sporty all-rounder from the 1000 PS editorial team. And of course, you already know me, Max, also a fan of sporty machines. So let's jump straight into the testing and take a look at our first category.
What can we say about the engine? Well, something that stands out, and we've already mentioned this in the past, is that the level of vibration becomes quite noticeable in a certain rev range. You feel it not only through the handlebars, but also a bit in the mirrors, especially in the range between 6,000 and 8,000 RPM, which is a range you're in quite frequently with this bike. The vibrations are very pronounced there in the mirrors. It's sometimes difficult to make out what's behind you because the high frequency micro vibrations make the image start to blur. You also feel it through the foot pegs. It's a bit of a drawback, you could say, that comes with this engine. And what's more, even though it may sound funny, this engine actually has the smallest displacement among our test group, despite being a 1000 cubic centimeter bike. That becomes noticeable, especially with the inline 4-cylinder layout, in that it doesn't deliver much punch in the lower revs. It really needs at least 6,000 or 7,000 RPM to get going properly. Once it's there, it revs out very eagerly. But in the lower range, where you'd really want the torque, especially out on the road, and we were riding tight hairpins where the revs drop to around 3,000 even in first gear, and that's where you'd expect a bit more torque on tap. That's where this engine lags a bit behind the competition in direct comparison. I do wonder a little why BMW hasn't gone the same route as some of its competitors and increased the displacement slightly. A bigger engine would be quite helpful, especially to deliver more punch from those lower revs. Maybe even adding a bit more rotating mass could help. It might also reduce the vibration issue somewhat. So maybe we'll see a slightly revised engine from BMW in this category in the future.
Fundamentally, I think the engine of the S1000R is actually sized just right for a hyper-naked bike. It doesn't take the top spot in terms of outright power. So in fact, I believe it's actually the weakest in this comparison, but that doesn't change the fact that it has more than enough punch for any road situation. What I really like about the engine is that for a pure inline 4-cylinder, it already has a decent amount of grunt in the lower revs, and it sounds great too. What I don't like so much, and you notice this pretty quickly, are the vibrations in the handlebar ends. They're pretty much always there on both in the lower and upper rev ranges. I really feel like that should be better by now. It's been an old issue with BMW engines, and I'm not sure why it still hasn't been addressed. It just doesn't need to be like that. On the other hand, something I do really like about the engine is the quick shifter. You do need a bit more force when shifting up or down compared to other bikes. The shift lever isn't rubberized either, and I tend to notice that. I'm someone who prefers a very precise, delicate feel, but especially the downshifts on this bike are really well done. They don't feel light in terms of effort, but they slot in really smoothly. Often I barely notice the gear change. And if you do a really aggressive downshift, it gives you a nice little pop from the exhaust. I personally really enjoy that. So in my opinion, this is a very good engine for spirited road riding.
We've got the electronic suspension from BMW on this bike, which actively adjusts damping during the ride. Preload, however, still needs to be set manually. The suspension overall is tuned to offer a decent level of comfort on public roads. That's especially nice over uneven surfaces. When you're dealing with potholes or bumpy stretches, the setup handles them quite well. The only downside comes at higher speeds. The damping is simply too soft. Combined with the bike's inherently agile geometry, this leads to a bit too much movement in the chassis. For example, when riding faster through sweeping highway curves, say above 130 kilometers per hour, you start to notice it getting unsettled. That's not just due to the chassis itself, which is clearly tuned for agility, but also because of the low damping levels from the suspension. And that's something where, as a more sport-oriented rider, you'd probably wish for a few extra clicks of damping just to get a more planted, stable ride and a more direct connection to the road.
Personally, I find this suspension more than sufficient for use on public roads. What I really like about these electronic suspension systems is that in theory, you could potentially tweak individual settings further with an upgrade, though that's not something that's available from the factory. As it comes, you just have the option to choose between road and dynamic modes and to adjust the preload. In my opinion, that's totally fine. When I switch between road and dynamic, there's already a noticeable and useful range in the way the suspension responds, both in terms of comfort and firmness. I never get the feeling that it's either too soft or too harsh. I can pretty much pick the mode that best suits the situation. Personally, if the road surface is smooth, I'll go with dynamic mode. But if I'm riding on typical secondary roads in the foothills or something like that, I'll tend to stick with road mode. It's clearly softer, but it soaks up more of the bumps, and that works really well. Plus, switching between modes while riding is quick and easy.
When it comes to seating position and ergonomics, it's clear that we're dealing with a more sport-oriented setup here. You can see that the distance between the seat and the steering head is quite generous, which results in a noticeably front-end focused riding posture, especially for taller riders. The handlebar width is well chosen, not too wide, not too narrow, and the bend feels great in the hands. So despite the sportier riding stance, there's still enough overall comfort that longer stretches don't feel overly tiring or unnecessarily strenuous. What I really like is how well the seat height and foot peg positioning are matched. The pegs are high enough to offer solid cornering clearance, but there's still enough distance to the seat that your knees aren't overly bent. At 180 meters tall with relatively long legs, I find the riding position to be pretty relaxed. Sure, there are bikes out there with an even more laid-back seating setup, but those typically don't offer the same amount of lean angle clearance. On the street, there's no issue at all with ground clearance from the foot pegs.
You sit on the bike in a sporty position, but without putting an excessive amount of weight on the front end or being cramped up with an overly sharp knee angle. It really hits a great middle ground here, and that's why I believe that in the sum of its parts, this bike is a very attractive option for a lot of riders. You can definitely tell that the BMW has a super sporty sister. The entire construction, the frame, the chassis is built for precision and stability. And interestingly, in tight corners or when we had to quickly switch lines along the route, we kept thinking it's eerie how stable it stays, yet how effortlessly it can still be flicked from one lean angle to the next. Then I realized our test bike is equipped with the optional forged wheels. And I'm convinced those have a real effect on the bike's handling, especially on quick direction changes. The handlebar on this BMW actually isn't particularly wide. It's a fairly flat bar, and in terms of width, I'd say it sits somewhere in the middle of the pack. So you do have to give a bit of input at the bars, but then it tips in really smoothly and playfully through the turns. As for the cast wheels that come standard, I imagine the bike feels a bit different with those, but with these forged wheels, the effect was definitely noticeable. You can dart through corners with such ease, yet the bike never feels twitchy or overly reactive. On the contrary, this blend that BMW has achieved in terms of handling is truly top-notch. I really like this aspect of the bike.
With this bike, The goal was clearly to create an extremely light and agile feel to make sure it could be flicked into corners quickly and sharply, especially when riding at pace. Contributing to that is the very wide handlebar, which really helps you tip the bike from one lean to the other in a playful, almost effortless way. And it works remarkably well. However, this extreme agility does come with a trade-off in terms of stability. You can feel it, especially at higher speeds, when you'd normally want more composure and feedback to build trust in the bike. That's where the BMW starts to feel a bit unsettled. It's not dangerous or truly unstable, but you do notice a bit of a wobble or flex, especially when you open the throttle and unload the front end. That's when the bike can start to develop a bit of a life of its own. It doesn't become a problem per se, it doesn't turn into full-on instability, but above speeds of around 130 or 130 kilometers per hour, things get a little vague, a bit soft. I'd say that's one of the downsides of this chassis design and dynamic setup. On the flip side, in tight switchbacks, those really narrow, slow speed turns, it's absolutely in its element. It's almost like riding a supermoto, extremely nimble, super easy to correct mid-turn, and very forgiving. In those situations, you don't really need that classic front-end feel or limit sensing precision. What you need is balance and maneuverability, and that's exactly what this layout delivers. But once the speeds rise, the bike starts moving around more, and it's something you need to get used to. Compared to its rivals, the BMW definitely loses out in terms of high-speed stability.
The electronics and user interface on the BMW S1000R really appealed to me, and here's why. Because it's all kept simple and is very intuitive to operate. Our test bike came with a few optional extras like the Pro Riding Modes package, but I don't even want to go too deep into each individual mode or feature. What I want to say overall is that I'm a big fan of BMW's rotary dial control, and I find the entire menu structure logical and easy to follow. Whenever I need to change a setting, it just works. It's quick, straightforward, and doesn't distract from the ride. And unlike the S1000RR, the S1000R actually has fewer adjustability options, which in this case is a good thing. This bike was built with the road rider in mind, and for that purpose it makes perfect sense to keep things manageable. Even when you go into the so-called dynamic pro mode and want to configure it to your liking, whether that's throttle response, engine braking, or ABS settings, you can do it easily and intuitively. As for the electronic suspension, there are two basic preset modes, road and dynamic. And honestly, what you see is what you get. The road setting worked really well for me on regular streets. It offers good comfort. And the dynamic mode is definitely usable for more spirited riding on the road, though it might be a bit on the firm side for some. All in all, the electronics package on the BMW is super solid. It's not the most advanced or the most feature-packed, but for real-world road use, I'd say it's sized just right.
We have very good adjustability for all kinds of riding aids. What I really like is that for those who want to have real fun on the road, you can even deactivate the rear ABS. I think that's great because it lets you really slide the bike into a corner. It also allows for a bit more maximum braking force. BMW gives the rider a lot of freedom here and lets you really move the bike around to create better feedback and feel. As a skilled rider, it's always easier, or at least less restrictive, when you have more freedom to push the limits of the bike.
Looking at the BMW S1000R's braking system, it's definitely not the flashiest choice. It has 320mm discs and somewhat dated Brembo M4 calipers, but the performance is really decent. What I particularly like is the brake lever's feel. They managed to achieve a really crisp, solid bite point despite the lean angle sensors and long brake lines. The lever is also adjustable. When it comes to actual braking power, it's solid and sporty enough. However, compared to the competition in this class, there are definitely more aggressive and stronger brake setups available nowadays. BMW itself offers M calipers on some other models, which deliver noticeably more bite. I know this from experience. That said, the average sport-oriented street rider will feel just fine here and probably won't miss anything unless they've tested a bike with those more aggressive brakes beforehand. After the country road action, we've now arrived at the Slovakia part 2 of our test, and we're dealing with changing conditions. It's a bit windy, and there's an occasional shower passing through. I hope it stays sunny for us. Let's take a quick look. What do we have for asphalt temperature? Yeah, 28.5, 29 degrees. Perfect. We also brought tire warmers, stands, pit carpet, everything you need for a serious attack on the racetrack. And now I'm hoping we can give you a solid insight and deliver proper test results in the sporty extreme range. Let's also take a quick look at our gear. You might have noticed that our test crew was all wearing Nex helmets, specifically the XR3R model. That's the sportiest helmet in the Nex portfolio. It's made with a carbon shell, pleasantly lightweight, 1,350 grams in size medium. And what I personally really liked was the great aerodynamics. With that additional spoiler element on the back, color matched to the visor, it really looks the part too. Visually, it's a real eye-catcher. Very classy and high-quality finish. The ventilation also impressed us. Even on the racetrack, our heads stayed cool. You can adjust it easily using the openings on the forehead, top of the head, and chin area. That all worked great. And what was also really nice was the snug, sporty fit. Especially for track riding, for sporty riding in general, it's truly a very exciting product. We really enjoyed it. Yeah, the BMW really scores points for me on the racetrack thanks to how accessible it is. It's just easy to ride. You hop on, reach forward, and you've got this nice flat handlebar that really gives you solid front-end feedback. You're sitting in a relaxed riding position, and once you select Dynamic or Dynamic Pro mode in the menu, there's really not much thinking required. The electronics are preset, well configured, everything just works. That accessibility and ease of handling does come at a bit of a cost when it comes to stability though. Especially in fast sections or sweeping high-speed corners, you don't quite get that planted, confidence-inspiring feeling in the saddle. And I think that's mainly because we've got the forged wheels on this bike. Those wheels really help with the nimble feeling on country roads where you feel totally at ease. Diving into tight bends is super easy, really playful. But out here on the racetrack, the lack of rotational mass becomes a bit of a drawback when it comes to stability and ultimately lap times. Subjectively speaking, I think I rode my slowest laps of the day on the BMW. Here at the Slovakia ring, a fast track with lots of flowing corners, I just couldn't quite build that last bit of trust in the bike. For example, when accelerating out of corners like onto the start-finish straight, you can see it in the background. There are markings on the tarmac, some bumps here and there, and in those spots the bike starts to feel a bit too twitchy. If you're not super precise with your body inputs, if you're not really pressing firmly into the pegs and bracing yourself well at the rear, you can end up introducing some instability just through your own movements. And the BMW doesn't absorb that or iron it out. Instead, it kind of amplifies it. So yeah, if you accelerate a bit sloppily out of a turn, you can end up with this little dancing, wiggling motion as you go down the straight. But again, this is in the high-performance, aggressive riding range. I think beginners or riders taking on their first ever track day, people who want a smooth, friendly and confident bike for the street, they'll be super happy with it. But in our group test here, we had a few other bikes along for comparison. As a journalist, you need that to get a sense of where each bike sits, where its strengths and weaknesses lie. And for me, with the BMW, this over-agility, this hyper-nimble character, which probably also comes down to the geometry and general chassis design, that really stood out here. And I have to say, it just wasn't my personal highlight. There were simply other bikes that I liked better.
We've got 170 horsepower here, which definitely isn't nothing, but it's still clearly less than what you get in a full-blown superbike. And you really notice that, especially on the racetrack. The rev ceiling has also been cut down a bit. We've got around 2,000 to 3,000 RPM less available compared to the double R. And again, that's something you feel particularly out on track. It doesn't exactly pull massively from low down either, where you might say, okay, I'll just ride it more in the mid-range. You're kind of constantly searching for the right part of the power band on this bike when riding at the limit. The different traction control settings do help. I rode it in the sharpest setting, where the system gives you the most leeway, and that actually works really well. It doesn't hold you back much. The super light handling is something that really stands out, but on the racetrack that actually becomes a bit of a downside because you lose a bit of precision. Especially on track, it's important for a rider to know how much grip is still left in the front tire when you're tipping into a fast corner. And a hyper nimble chassis setup like this doesn't necessarily help with that. The bike gets a bit twitchy, especially when you're carrying higher speeds. You start to feel some movement through the chassis. And when you pair that with the fully electronic suspension, the DDC system that BMW's been using for a while now, it just doesn't give you quite enough base damping, particularly for racetrack use. That kind of reinforces this twitchy character, especially in fast sections where you're trying to push hard into corners. And that's really where I'd wish for a bit more feedback from the front and a bit more overall stability.
All right, folks, we've come to the end now, but now it's your turn. Did you enjoy the video? Then please give us a thumbs up. And if you've still got any questions on your mind, feel free to leave them in the comments below. We always love hearing your feedback. And last but not least, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more test videos coming up as part of this series, and a big group comparison as well, where all the bikes are lined up side by side and we really dig into each model's strengths and weaknesses. So don't miss that. And now, seriously, take care everyone. See you next time.